Hello and welcome to the agenda. I am Ajay Kaul. In this program today, we will talk about steps being taken by the government to monetize assets and raise revenues. The Union Cabinet has cleared a bill to set up a government-owned development finance institution or DFI with an initial paid-up capital of rupees 20,000 crore. The government is also working on plans to monetize assets like roads, electricity transmission lines, airports and sports stadiums to boost revenues. What is the significance of these steps? How much can these steps help in boosting growth? We will discuss such questions in the agenda today with two experts on economy. We have with us Professor Arun Kumar and Professor Aman Agarwal. But before we start our discussion, have a look at this small report.
Government is working on a fresh set of proposals to boost development and revenues which are essential for high economic growth. As part of these measures, the government will bring a bill to set up a development finance institution or DFI with the initial paid-up capital of rupees 20,000 crore. It is intended to leverage around 3 trillion from the markets in a few years to provide long-term funds to infrastructure projects as well as for development needs of the country. The DFI will be fully government-owned initially and the promoter's stake will be brought down to 26% in the next few years. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said after a meeting of the Union Cabinet which cleared the bill, the government will continue to hold 26% in the entirety at all times. The government will also approach the regulators on increasing the cap for investment in the DFI by pension funds and insurance companies. The DFI will be an institutional arrangement which will help in raising long-term funds, Sitharaman said. The government will provide a 10-year tax exemption to funds invested in the DFI to attract long-term players such as insurance and pension funds. The government also plans to monetize assets which are under the purview of 8 ministries. These include roads, electricity transmission, oil and gas pipelines and telecom towers. The plan also includes awarding 150 passenger trains to private players, divestment of the equity stake of Airport Authority of India, the joint ventures that operate in the Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore and Hyderabad airports and leasing out of stadiums. These measures come against the backdrop of sliding tax revenues and a patchy record in meeting the disinvestment targets set in each of the last 5 years. Bureau Report.
Now let's welcome our guests, Professor Arun Kumar and Professor Agarwal. Welcome to the program, both of you. So let me go to Professor Arun Kumar first. About the government decision to create development finance institution. So how do you see this decision of the government? Professor Kumar.
We used to have these long-term lending institutions earlier, like ICICI, IFCI, etc.
Right.
But after 1991, with the new economic policies, these were, in a sense closed. And what their purpose was to provide long-term finance for infrastructure.
Right.
Because infrastructure requires long-term finance. So the banking system by itself, gets short-term funds, and if it has to lend long-term, then there's a mismatch between the money that it gets and the money that it lends out. And that's where I think the need has been felt that for long-term, lending institutions, which can lend for 20, 25, 30 years, because infrastructure usually does not become profitable for, 8, 10 years. The gestation period is quite long. And that is where but I think the problem that comes is that in a country which is very poor, if we build high cost infrastructure, then it leads to losses. And that's where the banks have been running into NPAs. So this problem of, how in a poor country we are going to construct the, high cost infrastructure, that needs to be sorted out. Otherwise the DFIs themselves will also start running into problems. So I think the issue is, what kind of infrastructure would it be financing and whether it would be viable or not. Those are the issues that will come along with having a DFI.
Professor Kumar, you talked about the funding of the infrastructure projects. We had or we have rather ILFS also, which I think was created for the similar purpose, but it is now in bad state. I mean, government has not been able to even help it. So how will this new institution be better than that?
No, that is where I'm saying that, for the DFIs, they'll have to raise long-term finance. And that is the same problem that, at the moment you have. So how will you get and where will you get? Maybe you get it from abroad, that's a possibility. But then you'll have to assure them a return. And if your infrastructure runs into losses, then, how will you pay them? There'll be some kind of sovereign guarantee. So I think these are the issues that need to be considered before we are able to assess whether the DFIs will help in raising long-term finance for financing the infrastructure, which is in bad shape in the country.
Right. I'll go to Professor Aman Agarwal about these questions. As you heard Professor Arun Kumar raising some questions about the long-term financing of the projects, infrastructure projects. So, what do you see? What do you say on that?
Yes, I think in India we have seen in this 70, 80 years with the introduction of the developmental financial institutions like the IDBI, the ISBI, the ICICI and others. But that had actually gone off with the factors thinking that the private financing would take over. And as it was kept in the past, the private financing or private institutional financing could actually not take over a large number of projects which are long-term projects like Arun talked about. And this is where the need for a developmental financial institution, which had actually been merged or taken off in the form of a bank and created more like a bank than a developmental financial institution like the ICICI or the IDBI as well as the others. Created this misnomer that we could actually go about financing, looking at banks which actually do short-term financing, projects which go up to this time of 5 to 10 years, not beyond. And this is where the need for the developmental financial institutions has come up. And it is not something which is happening in India. We've seen that you have the developmental financial institutions picking up the race again in Europe and even in the United States. They're trying to re-initiate and reboost these institutions to induce long-term growth and sustainability. Yes, you did mention the problem which we saw with one of the institutions, but I think that is something which they would be taken care of when the DFIs which are being proposed are going to be introduced, taking both the banking and the other institutions into account. And also, there may be chances that even the privatization movement or the disinvestment movement which actually is being focused upon may become one part of the nature and the functioning of the DFI, because even those private sector institutions which are wanting to take over some of these the stakes of the government or the publicly held stakes and take partnership in there or take over them, do not have the requisite funds purely to go about financing, which they are going to finance overseas funds and within the country. So this is where again the DFI will come into place to see the fact that the government's interest, the people's interest is not taken for a ride when some of these privatizations of this investment take place in some of these institutions through the investment made through the DFI.
Yeah, as I mentioned about ILFS, it's almost on deathbed right now. And we have been also talking about this, we need $1 trillion for infrastructure projects for maybe over a decade. And we have not been getting enough foreign funds or foreign investment in that sector. So what do you think are the reasons, Professor Agarwal?
No, you see, if you look at the last 1.5 years, technically most countries or institutions which would go about investing in long-term projects were not being able to do so given the fact the way...
No, I'm talking about over a decade. We have been talking about...
Yeah, I'm coming to that only now. Given the fact that, India has been recipient of large amount of foreign direct investment and the foreign exchange reserves have gone up, there is an extensive increase in interest which has gone up in institutions coming from across the globe, specifically in the last 6-7 years, given the new regulations, framework, structures, reforms which have taken place in the country. And that has actually built upon the framework of international institutions wanting to invest in India, where they're not seeing that kind of a growth or sustainability which India is ready to offer as against any other part of the world. And that is what something which brings it the right time for us to go about doing it and raising funds. Funds is not a problem. The problem is that they need equitable returns and sustainable returns, which will be there for them. And fortunately, India historically has shown that it has not been defaulting as such or any kind of payments in the past,
Right.
whereas various other countries have seen that kind of default. Yes, we've had our own problems, and I think the government will take care of those problems going forth in the DFIs in the future.
Right. Professor Arun Kumar, I'll ask you the same question. About $1 trillion we have been, inviting investors from abroad for over a decade or so, maybe 1.5 decades or so. I think it's for Prime Minister Manmohan Singh who started this in 2005 or so. But we have not been getting enough, enough response or appropriate response on that. What do you think are the reasons?
So, problem is, will you be able to provide a return to the foreign investors? If you are able to provide a return, people will come.
Right.
But this is where I think the problem is that, as I said earlier, in a very poor country, if you set up high cost infrastructure, then it's bound to run into losses. And that's why a lot of infrastructure projects have run into losses. And they have created NPAs, for the banks, whether it be in the roads or whether it be, in power sector, etc. There have been big losses. So, we have to have the appropriate policy of what kind of infrastructure do we want to finance. In a poor country, you have to have, not a very high cost infrastructure because people can't afford it, And at this point of time, when the rates of interest abroad, whether it be in Germany or France or elsewhere, are low, some amount of money may come. But then, as the bond rates rise, then the money can fly back also. And that's where I think we'll face problem. Long term, if the rupee devalues, then even with low current interest rates, then the rate of return may not be very high for the foreigners to come in. So, we need to really look at how to raise funds inside the country. And that is where I think the big problem will be, because post the pandemic, the decline in the rate of growth of the economy, the decline in the savings rate that has taken place, the decline in the investment rate in the economy has taken place because capacity utilization is very low. So these are some of the major macroeconomic problems that will be confronted. So ultimately, the burden may fall on the government itself.
Yeah.
And this is where at the moment also for the public sector banks, burden falls on the government, and with the DFI also, I suspect ultimately it will be the government which will end up financing much of it.
But Professor Arun Kumar, you mentioned about which sectors the infrastructure project should be. I think some of them are identified, like we have highways, we have railways, we have airports and power sector. In fact, these are the identified infrastructure areas where we need a lot of money.
No. So what I'm saying is that we have to build low cost infrastructure rather than high cost infrastructure. Our roads, etc., need not be like autobahns in Germany, and then we need to have proper transportation policy so that long-term transportation is via railways rather than by roads. So railways, will work at a much lower cost than the road, and there I think the viability is possible. So, we need to have appropriate transport policy, appropriate energy policy, so that, we can fulfill those requirements of infrastructure investment without incurring very heavy costs and without having to pay high interest rates, because that's what, foreign investors would look for. So I
Right.
think, we have to change our strategy, not just vis-a-vis, infrastructure, but an overall strategy of what kind of infrastructure we need.
Yeah. So Professor Agarwal, when we talk about DFI, so what do you think, how long can it go to maybe boost growth? Because right now our main challenge or main concern is boosting growth on. What do you say on that?
Yes, you see, there are two components to it. First of all, which you rightly pointed out, is the component of inducing growth and employment. And that is something which long-term projects like the infrastructure projects does bring in at a large scale, especially for the unskilled workers and also for the skilled workers to a great extent. And we have seen that there are empirical evidence which clearly shows that that kind of a structure is present and is prevalent. But there's a difference in the way DFIs are seen today as against what DFIs used to be in the 70s, 80s, and even in the 90s. Most of the DFIs, or developmental financial institutions at that time, used to raise their finances locally through bonds, as Arun was also talking about, And there the interest rate used to be higher because it was domestic bonds and you had to give returns which are higher than what the banks and financial institutions locally were given to an investor or even the capital market would offer, matching those kind of structures. Whereas most DFIs today, in the last 15 years, which are being talked about at the international platform, have two important components. One is that they have engagement of international agencies like the ADB, the World Bank, the IFC, the IDB, and other international agencies,
Right.
which give a fund at a lower rate of interest for developmental financial institutions as a conglomerate fund which they create to go be giving out through the DFIs which are being created locally by the government and guaranteed by the government. The second is that even countries, as a matter of fact, like the OECD countries, can now invest using this channel of DFIs, and we have seen that happen in the European DFI, the mechanism, where there have been countries which actually come forth and now start funding some of those projects as well. So those funds, instead of routing through the private investment or hedge fund investment and other investments which used to coming up, pension fund investment, go through the DFI route, a more secure route and a more creditable route to go about making investment, which is lower because their own countries get a lower rate of interest. So the expectations from a developing country like India is fairly safer, given the fact that the risk factors are fairly low in a country like India.
Yeah.
But this is where matching those resources with the requirements which are there, and we can clearly see the requirements. And as you rightly said, growth as well as the employment is a key
Yeah.
component of any of these structures. Will get it, and we have seen that in the past. But the model will be different from what we saw in the past with IDBI and IFCI, as against what we are seeing with DFIs now. And also, as I said, they are looking at even this investment being part of the DFI structure, wherein they will take
Yeah, I'm coming to that, yeah.
to take care of the equity of the people at large, which is invested as a public sector undertaking.
Yeah, as Professor Kumar was mentioning about the returns, so is there a kind of the sentiment is not appropriate or proper, so that the foreign financial institutions come into fund? Is the sentiment right, Professor Agarwal?
No, I think the sentiments are very much right as of today. As we can see, as I told you, the foreign exchange reserve, the foreign direct investment, which is coming in averaging around $5.5 billion per month, clearly shows the kind of international sentiment despite the fact that the COVID has been there. So we can clearly see that there is an interest, but we have to raise our safeguards like we saw the investment coming from China. So those safeguards have been risen in the last 1.5 to 2 years, and I think we are better equipped now. I will not say that nothing will happen tomorrow, but we are better equipped in a way to go about handling some of these funds. And there is a large interest because the kind of needs we have in this country are very well equipped and are required and can clearly evident, which need to be surfaced and fulfilled, including the smart city projects which are to be laid down, given the framework the internet is seeping into almost all spheres of life in terms of doing business and even education as a framework. So given that factor in place, the need is clear, the funding is there, and this framework which is required, I think the government is bringing in. And fortunately, international agencies like Moody's and others have actually rated India far
Right.
better as against what they used to rate in the past, despite the reforms, despite demonetization, despite the various other steps which have taken place. They have rated us well, and that is a very important indicator for any institutional investor or even a large country wanting to invest into a country, which they look at when they are trying to make investment in any country. Then just merely the returns. Returns are key components, but then these are also important factors which quantify as risk factors for any investment.
Right. Professor Kumar, I want to ask you the same question about the sentiment prevailing in India. As you heard Professor Agarwal mentioning that Moody's and others rating agencies have given, good rating for India. What do you say on that?
Well, our rating is not really very good. That's why the ministry was complaining that, at the given stage that we are in, we are not getting the kind of ratings that we should get, so that we can get loans at cheaper interest rates. So, the risk factor is quite high in India because our economy has been slowing down. Even before the pandemic, it had slowed down from 8.2%. Over 8 quarters, it had fallen to 3.1%. And if you take the unorganized sector into account, then we had actually slipped into recession even before the pandemic. So the risk factors are very high. And anytime you calculate a return, you calculate the interest minus the risk factor. This is why you see the returns on the Indian, investments turn out to be lower than what the, nominal rate of return shows. And then you also have the possibility of devaluation of the currency if the inflation rates are higher in India compared to the US or to the European or the Japanese markets. So when you calculate the return, then you calculate the interest rate less the risk factor, less the depreciation of the rupee that might take place, and that's why the rates of return turn out to be quite low. The second point I'd like to make is that 95% of investment in India is internal, only 5% comes from outside, and it is 95% that has dropped. So in 2012-13, when your investment rate was roughly about 36%, it had dropped to 28% roughly even before the pandemic, and during the pandemic it fell even further. So we need to revive the internal investment, because without the internal investment, the growth rate will not really pick up. So if only you get foreign capital in some infrastructure projects, but the rest of the investment is down, then the growth rate will not pick up in the economy. So I think we have to work not only at getting the foreign capital, but how to revive the investment, the business sentiment in India, and that will not happen unless capacity expansion increases. The second thing is that if cost infrastructure like in big railway corridors and big roadways, etc.
Yeah, I was coming to that about the government plan. Yeah.
And therefore, that does not generate much employment. And when you don't generate much employment, demand will not revive. So, in other words, we need. That's why I say we have to change the infrastructure strategy.
Right.
Put in investment into small infrastructure where a lot of employment will be generated, local incomes will be generated, and demand will revive. So I think we need to get overall strategy.
But Professor Kumar, as you mentioned about other, we have to raise revenues also. The government apparently has listed a number of areas where, I mean, there can be monetization of assets, like we have seen. I mean, railways, airports, even sports stadiums. So how do you see that government step?
The problem is that you see, on the one hand, you are trying to increase investment, on the other hand, you are disinvesting. So in the net, the capital formation is less. So when you look at the capital formation from the budget, you have to subtract the disinvestment in the of the assets from the capital investment, because somebody has to invest in that. So private sector which comes in to buy the product of the disinvestment or the monetization of the assets, they will divert their investment from somewhere to these things. So overall, the investment will not rise in the economy as a result of this. Second is that in a situation where incomes have come down, savings have come down, people don't have that kind of money to invest.
Right.
So asset prices will drop. When asset prices will drop, then your disinvestment and your monetization of the assets will suffer. So if you're trying to disinvest 1.75 lakh crore plus 2.5 lakh crore of monetization of assets, you need about 4.5 lakh crores. Now 4.5 lakh crores coming from the private sector will imply that they will reduce 4.5 lakh crore elsewhere. So therefore it will not succeed, and the asset prices that the government will get will be lower, and therefore there will be charge of crony capitalism, which you're selling your assets cheap to your own favored thing. And that is very likely because, there's a charge against the government capitalism, whether it be airports, whether it be in ports and various other things.
Yeah.
So, and then the public sector, the trade unions will object, like the farmers are objecting. So it create a lot of political discontent also. We've seen that today bank strike, other public sector units have also been striking, like in the defense sector, like in other sectors. So, at this point, we need to put all our heads together and see how to raise growth rather than bring in political contention.
Right. So, Professor Agarwal, how do you see Professor Kumar's views on the monetization? I mean, the government plan to monetize, and particularly when the government says that we are not going to privatize railways, but at the same time there are reports that 150 passenger trains will be handed over to private players. So, how do you see all that?
Yeah, first of all, just to add on to what Arun said, these are risk factors which you have identified with respect to the currency and the inflation. Most institutional investors around the world, including, developmental banks like the World Bank and the ADB and others, actually go about buying option contracts, forward contracts. Nowadays, whenever they do transactions, including, businesses which do small transactions of a few $1 billion across one country to the other, they now buy these forward contracts, which are option contracts, which actually go about hedging the risk of the devaluation or the inflation and other components. So that part gets reduced substantially when it comes to, going about looking at those risks. So that is something which was not there about 15, 20 years back when these development financial institutions used to be there. Secondly, it is right to say that there is monetization which is taking place of assets. And it is nothing wrong in it as long as, you're not giving complete control like the LIC which did. But then it's important to note as to when you say railways in particular, We have seen mechanisms in countries like France and even in the UK, where they have the government framework running parallel to the private framework as well. So it is not that the UK also they did this kind of privatization of railways where they had multiple trains. In Belgium, I saw that happen as well. So they've had multiple railways and railway lines go across the same branch. Now it is left to the consumer, and that brings in competition and induces efficiency in the mechanism. Please understand the railways is the largest network in the country, even today, and in fact in the world, as part of the mode of transportation from people to people, and largest carrier of people in this country.
Professor Agarwal, that is why there are questions, there are concerns. So we have to close. Maybe last comment. Yeah, please.
Yes, so given that factor, even the private player coming in cannot actually bring in any threat. And it is not that you're privatizing railways, it's only a small segment where you're saying, let us bring in more competition to induce more efficiency.
So it will be called a part privatization, is it?
Could be, but exact nature is not known as of today, even today.
Yeah. So we hope that...
Very quickly, I might say that, as Joan Robinson said, wherever you have public sector and private sector working together, public sector will run into losses. And therefore, you'll create more losses for the public sector because the better...
But Professor Kumar, sorry, but I think banks have done well. But PSU banks have done well, despite the competition for private players.
But they cannot compete with the private sector because there are social obligations on the public sector bank like Jandan account, etc.
Right.
So they'll never be able to match the thing. And that's why you see profitable things will go to the public sector. Similarly, in railways, the profitable lines will go to the private sector.
Yeah,
and the less profitable ones will remain in the railways, they run into losses.
Yeah, it's a very interesting debate, but unfortunately our time is up. So we had to close this program. But thank you both of you for participating in this debate.
Thank you.
This is all in the agenda today. Thanks for watching. I'll be back with another important topic tomorrow. Till then, goodbye.